Dobrý den, dámy a pánové, vážené kolegyně, vážení kolegové. Vítám vás v Telči. Vítám vás na 26. ročníku Konference Hodnocení kvality vysokých škol. Jmenuji se Kateřina Oleksíková, jsem z odboru pro kvalitu Masarykovy univerzity a jménem všech, kteří se na tomto setkání, na jeho přípravě podíleli, vás vítám a přeju nám, aby jsme si těchto v konečném důsledku intenzivních 24 hodin naplno užili, tak jak je naším zvykem, především sdílením, povídáním, informacemi, dobře, a hlavně dobrou náladou a inspirací. To je pro mě a doufám, že i pro všechny, kteří jsme se na dnešním programu podíleli, v podstatě to nejdůležitější. Předávám slovo panu projektoru Michalu Bulantovi na zahájení.
Dobrý den, milé dámy, milí pánové, děkuji Katce za úvod. Myslím, mě slyšet, já mám hlasový deficit, tak se spoléhám na mikrofony v poslední době. Já vás zdravím samozřejmě jménem Martina Bareše, rektora, který toho času někde v Tartu snad předává zlatou medaili univerzitě v Tartu, kterou si nepřevzali minulý týden na Dies Academicus, a tak to napraví v uvozovkách na cestě s panem prezidentem do Estonska. Vítám vás především ale vás, co jste přijeli tedy většinou do Telče na naší tradiční konferenci hodnocení kvality vysokých škol. Pokud se nemýlím, tak je to konference číslo 26. Reaguje někdo z vás významně na číslo 26? Na 25 všichni, ale já jsem občas chodívám na šifrovací hry a tam jak je něčeho 26, tak to okamžitě vede k nějakému dešifrování, protože 26 je písmen v anglické abecedě, tak je potřeba něco dešifrovat. Já doufám, že my dešifrovat nebudeme, protože, jak hnedka ukážu, hlavním slovem nebo jedním z těch hlavních slov výstupem z loňské konference, která, myslím, že nejenom podle mého názoru byla velmi povedená, byla důvěra, otevřenost, autonomie, sdílení, komunita, takže myslím, že mezi námi nic moc šifrovat nemusíme. Můžete se podívat, připomenout si ti z vás, většina z vás, co jste tu byli s námi loni, ti, co nebyli, tak můžete vidět, jak byla ta konference vnímána. No a my z té konference, z těch závěrů a řekl bych z toho úspěšného výstupu vlastně vycházíme i v pojetí konference Letošní a nejenom v pojetí konference, ale vlastně v tom, co jsme společně s mnohými z vás v loňském roce dělali. Bavili jsme se o tom, že méně může být více. Snažili jsme se naučit ze zahraničních systémů hodnocení kvality vysokých škol, že není potřeba přidávat novou a novou legislativu, další procedury, ale že občas je důležité škrtat. Škrtat nadbytečné procedury, duplicitní kontroly, neřešit detailní mikromanagement programů na několika úrovních a oprostit se od formální dokumentace bez reálného přínosu. Co naopak posílit? Posílit důvěru, otevřenost mezi státem, akreditační agenturou, školami, posílit strategický pohled na kvalitu, všimněte si, slovo strategické se prolíná celým letošním programem, posílit schopnost institucí řídit vlastní kvalitu a používat smysluplné indikátory místo kvantity dat. Či mota, silný systém, jednoduchý systém, externí evaluace má doplňovat, nikoliv nahrazovat interní procesy a, jak už jsem zmiňoval, reforma není jenom o tom přidávat, ale umět taky ubírat. Bavili jsme se o tezi, že současný systém hodnocení kvality vysokých škol vede k papírovému formalismu, chtěli bychom ale více důvěry a autonomie. Velké téma, které opět reflektujeme i na letošní konferenci garantství studijních programů. Shodli jsme se prakticky napříč, že systém má nereálná očekávání od garantek studijních programů a nejenom u nich, ale v případě dalších orgánů, ostatně je to tématem i veřejné diskuze aktuální, rozpor mezi odpovědnostmi a pravomocemi. Formální versus faktické vykonávání role garantů je, asi znáte všichni. No a konflikt s řízením pracovišť. Garant typicky není vedoucí pracoviště, nemá personální pravomoc. Silné téma, které pochopitelně a možná ještě podstatně víc než loni rezonuje i letos, je institucionální akreditace. V roce 2028, pokud mě zdroje neklamou, asi 9 škol obnovuje institucionální akreditaci. Je to za dveřmi, ale pořádně nevíme vlastně, jak se k tomu bude přistupovat. Takže samozřejmě velmi rádi přivítáme pana předsedu Národního akreditačního úřadu, který nás nejenom o tomto spraví. Trápí nás detailní reporting i při udělené institucionální akreditaci. To bylo zmíněno i na tom předchozím snímku. Mikromanagement, vstupování externí agenturou do interních procesů, fragmentace kvůli akreditacím po oblastech vzdělávání a paralelní existence 2 systémů, jeden pro školy s institucionální akreditací a ten druhý pro školy bez ní. Zase je to shrnuto do tezí: více kontroly neznamená více kvality, méně administrativy a více smyslu dává smysl. A chtěli bychom posílit důraz na zpětnou vazbu a metodickou podporu od akreditačních agentur, obecně i nenutně té jediné. No a velmi rád jsem viděl, že nově jmenovaný předseda Národního akreditačního úřadu pro terciární vzdělávání, profesor Miller, hned v červenci po svém nástupu v rozhovoru, který poskytl Univerzitas, zmínil a akcentoval některé z těch věcí, některé z těch tezí, které jsme vyprodukovali. My jsme se také s ním v užší skupince organizátorů této konference potkali a ty výstupy jsme mu předali. Některá z těch tezí, které pan předseda zmínil. Společné standardy jsou důležité, protože definují minimální kvalitativní úroveň vzdělávání. Zároveň se jedná o praktickou nutnost, protože studenti často přecházejí z jedné školy na druhou. K roli garanta se vyjádřil v tom smyslu, že bychom neměli ulpívat pouze na formálních kritériích, možná by šlo uvažovat i o radě studijního programu. No a zahajovala se debata o tom, jak pojmout institucionální reakreditace. K tomu samozřejmě proběhla už celá řada většinou neformálních, ale už i formálních jednáních. Za sebe pan předseda zmiňoval, že je mu blízká koncepce institucionálního auditu, tak jak s ní pracoval tehdy neúspěšný návrh zákona o kvalitě. Já mám docela radost teď z aktuálních debat o novém zákonu o vysokých školách, protože ti, co jste si přečetli některé teze, které většina z nich nebyla šířena ve veřejném prostoru, ale pokud jde o teze v oblasti kvality, tak vlastně řekl bych naprostá většina toho, o čem se tady bavíme, je v těch tezích obsažena. Ať už jsou to rady studijních programů, nějakým způsobem odražené kolektivní garantování, méně inherence do vnitřních procesů, větší autonomie pro vysoké školy, konstrukt institucionálního auditu a další. Samozřejmě já jsem se účastnil fokusní skupiny nebo 2 fokusních skupin, které se toho tématu týkaly. Myslím, že je tam samozřejmě spousta otevřených otázek. Já byl v detailu, ale v té otevřené debatě, kterou my tady spolu vedeme, kterou si myslím, že minimálně v téhle oblasti a v oblastech studia vedeme s ministerstvem, s tvůrci věcného záměru zákona, takže že to vlastně mě nabíjí optimismem do příštích dní. Já vám přeji, ať minimálně do těch příštích 2 dní ať ty minimálně příští 2 dny nabíjí optimismem vás, i pokud jde o témata, kterým se naše konference věnuje, totiž strategické řízení, vzdělávací nabídky a garantství studijních programů v nové dekádě kvality. Vypadá to, že budeme mít neobvyklé skvělé počasí, takže přeji, ať si užijete ve nemnoha volných chvílích i telč a pobyt tady na půdě Masarykovy univerzity. Hezké dny přeji.
Děkuji i za to shrnutí loňského ročníku, které jasně ukazuje, kterým směrem míříme. A já rovnou předám slovo kolegu Honzovi Besedovi z Centra pro studium vysokého školství. Trošku ty instituty a centra se nám tak jako zmnožila, tak jsem se radši musela podívat. který v podstatě uvede ten první blok a bude moderátorem prvního bloku zahraniční inspirace.
Okay, so I will switch to English because we have two international guests. One is online already, and I'm glad to also introduce you Anna Gover, who is a director of European Agency, Agency for Quality Assurance. So she will start first, and we will speak about ESG today from different kind of perspective and how these standards and guidelines, I will sit because she can see me, are related to Czech higher education system. And the second speaker is with us here already. I'm happy to also introduce you Colin Tück, who is, I would say, Emerit Director of EQUAR, which is a register of agencies. Currently, Colin is working for KIC Malta, which is also a very important institution in Europe. It's a part of, I don't know if you heard it, it's about so-called European Education Digital Hub, which is great initiative which supporting digital kind of learning. And I'm also happy that I'm also, since these days, I'll be also the ambassador of this activity in Europe. So this is also a very important activity. For instance, Colin was working on interoperability framework, which helps us to set up basic standards for different IT systems, which we can use it, and we can easily transfer the data around different kind of institutions, between different kind of institutions and data of learners. So I would not maybe talk more because we have a little short delay. So I will give a floor now to Anna, and she will show you what is coming now around ESG, what is happening, and how it's very important for the Czech system. So Anna, floor and screen is yours. Please.
Thank you very much. I will just check that you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you,
yes?
And see the first
Very
slide
good.
of presentation.
Excellent. Yes, thank you indeed for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I have visited the town before and it's really beautiful, so I'm sad to miss that opportunity, but grateful nonetheless to be able to join you online. So I've been asked to speak a little bit about the ESG, the European Standards and Guidelines for Quality Assurance in the European higher education area. There is a revision of this document underway at the moment. So I will give a short overview of some of the changes and reflect a bit on the drivers for those changes. So the intention is not to go into too much technical detail, but to look at some of the bigger themes and look at the ESG in the broader context of what's happening in higher education. Why am I speaking about this? ENCA, as the representative body of quality assurance agencies in Europe, is one of the co-authors of the ESG. Other stakeholder organizations also collaborate on it. And personally, I serve in the capacity as secretary to the steering committee that is leading this revision process. So, why have we started with this revision? The Bologna process ministers gave the authors of the ESG the mandate to do this back in 2024 with the Tirana communique, which is the communication that comes out of the ministerial conference that takes place every few years. Now, I should say that the quality assurance community in Europe have been talking about this revision for a while, and indeed, ENCA, together with some of the other stakeholder partners and ESG authors, ran a project from 2022 to 2024 to gather some perspectives on the ESG and to reflect on what was working, what might need changing, and how it is being implemented in practice. So this gave a really good evidence base for taking forward the revision, and the political mandate came then in Tirana in May 2024. I think it's really important to emphasize that the ESG are widely recognized as a success story for the Bologna process. So having a common framework for internal and external quality assurance is something that has developed over the past couple of decades in the European higher education area, and as said, is widely seen as being one of the success stories. So the revision of the document is not because the ESG don't work or because something has failed in this pan-European quality assurance framework. It's rather about bringing them up to date with current practice, making sure that they reflect ongoing developments, and of course also making some adjustments based on the lessons learned of the past 10 years of use. So the current version of the ESG was published in 2015, and there was a previous version before that, which was in place from 2005 until 2015. Now, you'll see from the quote from the communique that we're expected to propose this revised version by 2026. Yes, we're in 2026 already, but we're not finished yet. We are expecting to present the final draft to the Bologna follow-up group in November, and we hope that they will approve it there and then to be finally formally adopted by the ministers in May 2027. Now, this may seem like a very long timeline, but I think it's important to note that this is because it is a stakeholder-owned document. So consultation is really critical for the ownership and the acceptance of the ESG, which has been one of the success factors in the past. And of course, we want to continue with that. So a bit more concretely, why are we doing this update? As I said, it's not because something specific has failed or is not working, but the mandate that you saw on the previous slide references ongoing developments and the need to reflect and respond to those. So what are they? I've mentioned a few here on the screen, divided into three categories: the sort of bigger picture societal trends that we see specifically in higher education, and those linked more specifically to quality assurance. But of course, the lines between those are very blurry, so that division is perhaps a bit artificial, but for the purposes of a nice presentation, I permitted myself to take this approach. Of course, in terms of the bigger picture, digital transition is one of the big issues that not just higher education, but society in general is grappling with at the moment, and particularly the really fast pace of change that we see with the now commonplace use of artificial intelligence. Next to that, we also have the green transition and an enhanced focus on issues around sustainability. And of course, we also have find ourselves in a situation of more geopolitical instability, things that we perhaps took for granted 5 or 10 years ago are not necessarily so firmly in place now. And we see that also in higher education when we look at the issues around internationalization. There is, of course, increased internationalization in higher education, particularly within Europe, but also globally. But there is also a tension there between some national political trends that are more inward-looking and more towards nationalism. And this internationalization in higher education is, and the questions around it is then, of course, also carried over specifically into quality assurance. For international higher education initiatives to work, quality assurance also has to work across borders. Also in higher education, we see a number of other policies that have come out of the Bologna process, which demonstrates other topics that are high on the agenda at the moment. Also in the Tirana communique, there was increased focus on the social dimension of higher education, and the ministers endorsed statements on the fundamental values of higher education. Finally, we see much more focus on flexible learning pathways and lifelong learning, and this is something that quality assurance has to address. Now, when we look at the quality assurance trends, these are all things that we have to keep in mind if we're designing or redesigning a quality assurance system. We see, in general, a growth in the maturity of internal and external quality assurance. And this means that perhaps some of the approaches that we were using 10 or 15 years ago are not so relevant today. The higher education system institutions have moved on. And in this regard, the balance between accountability and enhancement can be particularly challenging. So the maturity of systems means that in general across Europe, we see a growing emphasis on the enhancement aspect of quality assurance as opposed to the accountability aspect. This allows institutions to design their internal approaches in a way that are more fit for purpose, because we as the higher education community, but also society, trust them to do that because of the maturity of the systems. And usually this means they can be more flexible, responsive, and holistic. Accountability, of course, remains really important, but without the enhancement aspect, we don't stand much chance of moving beyond basic standards. Another factor that comes into play here is the evaluation fatigue. I'm sure many of you within your institutions feel like you're being externally reviewed and evaluated too often. This is certainly a trend across Europe. And linked to that is then this concept of QA inflation, that QA is expected to address more and more diverse topics, going beyond the traditional focus on learning and teaching. So looking at all this, what's the role of the ESG in either addressing these changes or in some cases promoting the changes? Now, as I mentioned before, we did quite a lot of background consultation before the start of the revision process, and all of this resulted in a number of conclusions which the authors took as the starting point for the revision. The first one is don't fix what isn't broken. As I said, we're not reviewing this and revising this because there's been some critical failure in the use of the ESG as a quality assurance framework. So we certainly need to take what we know is working and build on that. And building on that means bringing it up to date. But this is also quite challenging because we don't necessarily want to anchor the text of the ESG specifically in the years that it was written. To illustrate, perhaps there was a similar discussion in the last revision process in 2015 as to whether MOOCs should be specifically mentioned in the text of the ESG. MOOCs were all the rage at that time. They were going to revolutionize higher education, but a decision was taken by the ESG authors not to specifically refer to them, but to rather say that the ESG should apply to all forms of education, including online education, in order to not put these kind of buzzwords in that are very much of the moment, even if the bigger picture, they may still be relevant. Of course, we want to make sure that the ESG are aligned with other Bologna process policies. I mentioned already those related to the social dimension of higher education and fundamental values. But linked back to this concern about QA inflation, there was also a lot of caution about overloading the ESG with too many topics. If you ask the pan-European quality assurance framework to cover too many things, you risk diluting its original purpose. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. And of course, there's a need to update the document based on experience of using it over the past 10 years. And in some case, this means also moving some aspects from the guidelines and into the standards. So making things which previously were perhaps considered good practice and moving those to become requirements. And for those that want to study the text in more detail, you'll see that perhaps some of the changes that are being made very much reflect things that are happening anyway, and it's just to push that forward in the small areas where it may not be happening. So this change is very much an evolution, not a revolution. Now, I mentioned earlier the purposes of the ESG, and I think when thinking about the revision and what should go into the ESG, it's important to revisit the original purpose. And this was very much to support trust between systems, between higher education systems, in order to enhance and facilitate mobility, international cooperation, and the recognition of qualifications. And this still remains very much at the core of the ESG. What is it that needs to be common to all QA systems in the EHEA in order for us to trust each other? The ESG is this structural underpinning for trust, so that we know what we need to be doing the same in order to trust each other. You might also see here, for anyone that's very familiar with the current document, there are now listed 5 purposes. The one, whereas in the current version there are 4, the new one is around supporting diverse groups of stakeholders in continually monitoring and enhancing the education provided. And throughout the revision process, we've seen some of the changes demonstrate a renewed emphasis on stakeholder involvement and the enhancement aspect of quality assurance. Now, I talked there a little bit about the concept of trust, and trust in higher education, as in any aspect of life, is not about blind faith. It's about an expectation of predictable and positive behaviour. And predicting that behaviour with confidence is made much easier if we're all working within a common framework of values, principles, and standards. So the ESG are there to provide that framework, to underpin that behaviour, to steer that behaviour, so that the different actors within the quality assurance ecosystems are hopefully able to trust each other. Now, one might argue, if we all say that we trust each other, maybe we don't need the ESG, we don't need external quality assurance anymore. But of course, no, as is always the case, we need the framework to fall back on in case things should change. We have laws not because everybody is stealing things all the time, but we have laws to make sure that if somebody does, that we have a framework to fall back on. So now I will just run through a few of the things that are changing in the ESG, and this is by no means a comprehensive overview of that. I just pick out a few things which might be interesting for your further discussions. And I should also preface this with a disclaimer. We say in English, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And as I said, we're expecting the final version to be approved in November. So this is still work in progress, and I can't promise that absolutely everything I say will remain the same between now and November. Now, in terms of the standards for internal QA, here in terms of the requirements for having a policy for internal QA, there is more of an emphasis on having a holistic approach. So the scope of the ESG remains on learning and teaching. That is the mandate that we have within the Bologna process. However, what's been added is a requirement to reflect the links between learning and teaching and the other institutional missions and activities. This very much recognizing that institutional missions do not exist in isolation, and we want to encourage the holistic approaches, depending, of course, on the type of institution. In the discussions around the revision, there was some pressure to include quality assurance standards for research. But as I said, the mandate of the work of the European higher education area is firmly fixed on learning and teaching. So we didn't include those, but there is a requirement to link the quality assurance for learning and teaching with the quality assurance for other institutional missions. The standards for internal quality assurance, if you look at them in the latest draft, it also looks like there are fewer standards. That's because 2 of them have been merged. So previously there were separate standards for program design and approval and for program monitoring and review. These have been merged together in order to simplify the ESG, but of course, quality assurance agencies are still free to address these issues in their own criteria and in their own processes in whichever way we want. they want. And we see various models within agencies as to how they do that in practice. And naturally, there's a much stronger reference to digitalization to reflect the current context. We've had a lot of discussions about whether it is possible to future-proof the ESG, and I think the rapid changes that we've seen with the use of artificial intelligence in the last couple of years make clear that that's not possible. But we have made a specific reference to the use of artificial intelligence to make clear that this should be responsible and human-centered when it's used in learning, teaching, and assessment, and in quality assurance itself. Some of the other changes in the standards for internal quality assurance reflect a more holistic approach to learning and teaching. So, for example, the standard on teaching staff now covers all staff involved in education delivery, not just specifically the teacher standing at the front of the classroom. And there's added reference to the need for staff well-being, to support staff well-being, mental health, and have positive employment conditions. Similarly, with the learning environment, this is expanded to cover all kinds of digital and physical infrastructure, resources, and support services for students. And finally, throughout the ESG, the revised version, you'll see an enhanced focus on transparency and information provision. This goes through the whole document. In terms of external quality assurance, there's a stronger focus on the fitness for purpose and reflecting on the aims of the external QA to ensure not just that these are clear and agreed by all stakeholders, but the methodologies and the processes that are used for external QA actually reflect the aims. So this is quite a common pitfall, is that it's easy to say, yes, we support enhancement-led approaches through our external QA, but it can be quite difficult to do in practice. And we want to make sure that there is this alignment between the aims, the processes, and the methodologies. Similarly, when talking about alignment, we want to see a clear and transparent link between the external QA standards, the evidence that is considered, the outcomes of the process, and then the decision-making at the end of it. And linking back to the issue of transparency, there's an additional requirement to publish any other documents that are used in the decision-making process. And finally, I mentioned the standards around complaints and appeals, that institutions and programs should have the opportunity to challenge the outcomes of external QA processes. This has been a challenging area for quite a few quality assurance agencies. So here is a clear example of a change that we are making based on previous use, not because we want to make this standard easier, but rather to make clearer the expectations towards agencies, but also the legal framework, because here there's usually an interconnection between the two. And finally, in terms of the ESG, we have a part that's about standards for quality assurance agencies themselves. And here I pick up on a couple of points, one being the independence of agencies. Independence remains one of the core features of external QA in Europe. It's really a hallmark of the European higher education area. And there is a strong desire to maintain that. But we recognise that it's also a significant challenge for agencies. So this is one of the key things that it's really important to pay attention to when revising a legal framework for quality assurance. We tend to talk about 3 dimensions of independence. These are currently listed in the guidelines of the ESG and will be moved up into the standards. And that's organisational independence, operational independence, and independence of outcomes. There's also been a clarification in this standard that independence means independence from any single party, not just a third party. And that is there because it reflects the growth of private agencies that might be controlled by a single private founder who is in fact an internal stakeholder. And that's okay, but it's also important to have the checks and balances in place to make sure that they don't have an undue influence on the quality assurance decisions and the operational independence of the agency. Next point is the enhancement activities of agencies. This is currently a standard on thematic analysis, where agencies are expected to look at all their external QA reports and do some analysis based on a particular topic. And what the revision of this standard is doing is broadening the definition of what we understand by the enhancement activities of agencies in order to recognise the different ways in which agencies are already working on enhancement aspects, and also to give scope for agencies to engage with this requirement in different ways. And finally, there'll be some increased emphasis on professional conduct and integrity of agencies to make sure that they have the tools and policies there for consistency and professionalism across all of their external QA activities. It is in the current version, but we want to make sure that this comes through a bit more strongly in the text, and particularly to reference that the work of agencies should be held to the same standard when working across borders as when they're working in their domestic context. And this reflects the growth in and focus on internationalization, not just in higher education, but also in quality assurance. So a final few words perhaps on the link between internal and external QA. I've talked a bit about independence of quality assurance agencies, and of course independence doesn't mean not speaking to anybody. All the higher education actors are interdependent. So throughout the revision of the ESG, we've tried to encourage and put more emphasis on stakeholder engagement in internal and external quality assurance, so that this promotes a discussion on the quality assurance system, the methodologies and the standards across all stakeholders. But it's also important to maintain one of the key principles of the ESG, which is that it is institutions that have the primary responsibility for the quality and the quality assurance of their education provision. So agencies have to reflect on how they can best support this. And this is why the revision has also tried to put some increased emphasis on enhancement approaches. So a requirement to look at the internal QA system of an institution as a whole, because of course QA procedures are not in isolation, and it's not just about ticking off specific standards, but to look at how the whole thing works as a whole. I would also mention perhaps the question around innovation and flexibility. Is it the role of the ESG to promote innovation in quality assurance and in higher education? Think back to the main purpose of the ESG, to have core standards so that we trust each other, to have some core common elements that are the same across all higher education systems. But that's not to say that everybody has to do everything in the same way. So while sometimes the ESG are criticised as not pushing forward innovation enough, the really important thing is that they don't hinder it. They should not be an obstacle for innovation. So there is space and flexibility within the standards to use different approaches if these are well justified, well evidenced, and come out of the necessary stakeholder consultation. So to finish, this is just the timeline for the review process. I mentioned this, I think, briefly already. We're expecting the final version to be available in November of this year, with formal approval in May of next year. And of course, at the same time of the revision of the ESG, we also have a revision of the European approach for the quality assurance of joint programs. This is a specific tool for external QA of joint programs to be used where program accreditation is necessary by at least one partner within the consortium. And it is explicitly based on the ESG. So of course, when you change one, it's necessary to change the other. We're slightly further behind on the timeline for that. We're expecting approval from the Bologna follow-up group at the first part of next year, but then also for formal approval by the ministers in May 2027. So I hope that gives a little bit of a framework for your future discussions, a little glimpse of what's coming ahead. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions and wish you a very successful and fruitful discussions over the coming sessions.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I hope that, do you have any kind of questions on, would you like to ask Anna? Any specific questions? Not yet. Oh, maybe one question from me before Colin will come to computer. I would like to ask you, based on your experience and let's say your umbrella position a little bit over the system, what would you see as the most important trends in quality assurance, and what kind maybe advice you can, if you can give to like Czech system, which is in some kind of, we have now a new agency like little baby, it's looking for the new world, but it's coming also from some old family habits. So what on which aspects we should focus and which is reflecting these trends in Europe from your perspective? Somebody mute you, or you mute yourself?
No, I muted myself. There we go. back on again. Yes, maybe I could mention two things, because they're kind of at, you know, I don't want to say opposite ends of the spectrum, but you know, different ends of the continuum, let's say. It's really important to get the basics right. And actually sometimes the basics of the legal framework can be most challenging. So things like the independence of the agency, the resourcing of the quality assurance agency are really critical foundations for the future success. Because often these are things that are written quite concretely into national legislation. We see that across many countries, and if that independence is not sufficiently assured within the national legislation, it can be very difficult to backtrack and to change that later on. In a similar vein, too much detail in the national legislation can be constraining further down the road. You know, often when countries are revising their national frameworks, we advise them not to put too much prescriptive detail into the legal framework in order to afford some flexibility later on. The other thing then perhaps is around you asked about trends, and I'll repeat what I said in the presentation about the growing maturity of both internal and external quality assurance systems. And I think that needs reflecting and recognizing, even if some of the specific bodies involved are newer. They don't come out of nowhere. Your institutions have been doing quality assurance for a long time. So it's important to reflect that in the frameworks, and the emphasis on the stakeholder involvement and the discussions and consultations that lead up to changes in quality assurance frameworks is I think really critical to the future success of the framework. And we see that model with the ESG in general. I said that, you know, this revision is taking 2 years, but that's because we're trying to talk to everybody and make sure everybody's view has been heard. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will agree with the final version. Of course, it's impossible to please everybody, but at least there is, you know, an important process of consultation, and so that stakeholders have had the opportunity to express their views, and many of those views are being then taken up and are reflected in the final version. And that kind of European level process is, you know, I think something that can also be replicated, perhaps even more easily on the national level.
Okay, thank you very much. Question? Okay, I think we can now give the floor to Colin, and I hope that you can stay with us, and maybe there can have some questions. Even you can ask some question, Colin, based on your presentation, and maybe then Colin later can ask you. So Colin will now reflect. His presentation will focus on the Czech system a little bit more, and experience with the Czech system, and I will give him now the floor. Mike.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for also for the kind invitation to join you in Telch. Luckily, I was able to come here, and I haven't been here before, and I having seen the town, I would regret if I had not come, for sure. Seems very beautiful. Now, while we're waiting for slides, maybe I can just say a few words also as a kind of disclosure and disclaimer about my comments. As Jan said before, I used to work in the European Quality Assurance Register until 3-4 years ago, for a little while. So I've been involved in quality assurance at higher education at European level for some years. Now I'm working for a Knowledge Innovation Center, KIC, which is actually, you said KIC Malta, we're actually based in 3 places, in Malta, Slovenia and Brussels. And we're a small team of 20 people that work as a consultancy firm for different projects and service contracts. And you mentioned the Digital Education Hub. So we do a lot of things in the field of innovation and digitalization of processes in education. But I'm still keeping a little bit an eye on quality assurance from time to time. Now, the disclaimer, or kind of what are my remarks based on? Of course, I've let's say sometimes been in touch with the Czech system during my time back at ECHA and before, but also 2 or a year and a half ago, I had the pleasure to support the Czech Ministry of Education in reviewing some draft amendments to the law on higher education. They never materialized, but still, of course, that influenced my comments a little bit now. So they are based on reviewing that a year and a half ago, reviewing what is this situation now, and of course some exchange with Jan and Katka and other colleagues. Okay, so with some, as Jan said, I'm working otherwise also in the field of interoperability. Luckily, HDMI is such a good interoperable standard, so it's easy to plug in your computer. I'm sorry for Anna, but I know you have the slides on email, so I guess it will be okay. As I said, these reflections are based on a little bit of looking into the legal framework on Czech quality assurance in higher education a bit more than a year ago, and refreshing this impression now. Before going into some reflections, I just wanted to also underline maybe the dual purpose of quality assurance. I think Anna has already kind of spread the gospel, but just really to start out with stressing once more that quality assurance should always bear in mind this double purpose of accountability and enhancement. So this is, has been enshrined in the ESG for a while. Anna has just reaffirmed that won't change, of course. The idea is that, of course, we have an important accountability function about public trust, value for money, and of course that also ultimately supports recognition of qualifications and recognition of institutions across borders quite strongly. But there's also a strong enhancement role for quality assurance to support institutional strategy and implementing institutional strategies, and enhancing and innovating education offers and programs. To also make sure, and of course this dual purpose should ensure that we're not talking only about compliance, but also about quality culture and using quality assurance as a tool for enhancement. I would say, of course, we have to be realistic, that it's clear that different levels of quality, this generally should apply to internal and external quality assurance in different forms. But of course, we have to be realistic that external quality assurance will naturally maybe always be a bit more focused on accountability, while internal quality assurance might be more focused on enhancement and the strategic steering in the institution. But nevertheless, none of the levels should neglect one of these dimensions entirely. Now, I would just start with some overall reflection on the legal framework as far as I can see it, and then dive into 2-3 topics in a bit more detail. So in general, my impression was that in Czechia you have quite a good foundation for the the external quality assurance systems in higher education, and for the also for the National Quality Assurance Agency to do its work in line with the ESG. I also found that the approach with institutional accreditation on fields of study, it maybe strikes a good balance, at least for the time being, between this, well, let's say, in many cases you have this two extreme poles of having external accreditation for every single study program, or having external accreditation at institutional level, giving complete freedom to an institution to set up any programs once you have an institutional accreditation. I find the institutional accreditation with field level is kind of an interesting middle ground, because it gives more freedom to institutions to establish own programs, but it doesn't yet go to the full open way as some systems with institutional accreditation. But I would of course be interested to hear also what colleagues in the room feel if this is a good balance for the Czech higher education system at this moment in time. In general, I found from the information that I had, as said, some review I did a year or so ago, and some catching up with the situation now, that in general there seems to be also a good legal framework that ensures independence of the accreditation agencies. But I do also see that there are maybe some gaps remaining, and some issues that I would see a little bit critical when looking at it from the let's say, with the glasses of European standards and European frameworks. So I'll go into this a little bit briefly, and of course to start maybe with independence, quite an important topic of the ESG, and I understand also a topic that was, let's say, maybe quite relevant for some revisions and changes in the legal framework in Czechia to make sure that the agency can have sufficient independence to prove its alignment with the ESG. I'm trying to look at it in the three dimensions that I think Anna already mentioned, and that have been, how to say, a key element of the ESG to break independence down in three dimensions or three levels. To start maybe with the organizational level, on the positive side, I found it is there is a clear organizational status for the National Accreditation Bureau. I also found there was there are clear provisions for appointments and so on. But I would say there might be some need to strengthen some things, and maybe some specific points that I felt when looking at the current framework that might need to be strengthened is, on the one hand, safeguards against for dismissals of members of the accreditation bureau, so that it's clear that this is an exceptional scenario and cannot be, let's say, abused for political interference or something like that, and maybe also to increase the transparency in some scenarios where the ministry might reject a nomination from a stakeholder organization, or use some of the safeguards to bypass the nomination route, which of course are important to make sure that no one externally can block the agency from functioning. On the other hand, of course it is important to ensure utmost transparency in these cases, so that if the ministry uses any of this, it needs to document why and what are the reasons. One thing that might be another critical point in the organizational setup, not only about independence, but also maybe referring to another ESG standard on involving stakeholders in the governance of the agency, which I also understand from the draft will be strengthened a little bit in the new version, underlining that the stakeholder involvement needs to be meaningful. And I saw that there's currently only one student, at least one student guaranteed by the legal framework out of a council of 15 people or so, if I remember correctly, which might be a rather low proportion, considering how key stakeholder students are in higher education. So maybe that could be another point that would be worth considering in terms of organizational independence. when it comes to the operational level, my general impression was that seemed largely well ensured, with one exception, that the decision on the operational accreditation standards, if I understand things correctly, lies with the government and not with the accreditation agency. But I'm going into this a bit more in the next step, because I know this is a common topic in many national systems. And finally, it also seemed to me that the authority of the National Accreditation Bureau for the final outcomes of so the accreditation decisions and reports seem to be quite well established in the law. I wanted to say a few more words about maybe suggestions or ideas for a good architecture when it comes to setting and deciding on accreditation standards, because I know this is a topic that arises in many national systems when discussing about quality assurance systems and who should have responsibility for which. I think what I found positive is to start with is that the law on higher education already defines some key thematic areas that the accreditation standards should cover. I think that in general is a good practice, because of course this is maybe a delicate balance to be struck between on the one hand the agency, a national accreditation agency, in being independent and defining also its quality assurance processes and shaping the accreditation standards. But of course there's also a legitimate interest of the lawmaker and the parliament to set the main areas that should influence the accreditation standards. So I think generally the approach of having key areas defined in the law is a good one, and one that is also used in many other systems. It might be worth mapping what is now set out in the law as key areas to map that against the European standards and guidelines, and also especially part 1 of the European standards and guidelines, because that is also something that the agency will need to do when going through an external review against the ESG to apply for registration on ACCA and so on. They need to show, of course, how part 1 of the ESG is reflected in the national accreditation standards. What at the same time I do find important is that the law maybe sticks really to the key areas, but does not go to start setting the detailed operational standards or the detailed criteria that are really then used by peer review panels, because of course that also is maybe a step further that requires a lot of expertise in quality assurance, and that goes beyond let's say the overall political steering of the parliament and the government. And that process of turning these key areas into actual operational standards, of course, is something that should be done by an accreditation agency. But I think also Anna mentioned that already earlier. It is important that that independence here does not mean the agency should not speak to stakeholders. On the contrary, I mean the agency has of course, the final the agency's bodies will have the final decisions on that. But in this process, of course, all stakeholders need to be adequately involved. And I just noted in this regard of turning this into standards, I just noted one point here that, of course, is an important change introduced by the draft ESG 2027, which is that also the use and responsible use of AI in teaching and learning should be covered in the standards, and that's of course something that might need to be updated or considered when when moving forward. What I do find important is that the final decision on the really operational and practically used accreditation criteria, in my view, should always rest with the quality assurance agency and their governing bodies or their councils. So what I consider problematic in the current setup is that the final operational standards are really a government decision. So I think that is something that I would at least advise to review to underline the independence of the agency. Now, finally, I'm just going to go a little bit into the European dimension for 2 points. One that was already touched upon by Anna is the European approach for quality assurance of joint programs. As Anna said, it's and I guess how many of you know the European approach for QA of joint programs? I see some people not raising their hand. I'm sure they know. So the European approach for QA of joint programs is an additional framework based on the ESG that was, as Anna said earlier, adopted by ministers to facilitate the quality assurance of joint programs if they are subject to program level accreditation or evaluation. Of course, it's something that has to be adopted or made possible in all national regulations and frameworks. So I checked a bit the data that is officially published by ECHA, who are also monitoring the use of the European approach and the implementation in national systems. What we can see there is that on the one hand, quite a few Czech higher education institutions have already used the European approach, either by being coordinators of joint programs themselves, or maybe also by just being involved in a joint program consortium that have used the European approach coordinated by another partner institution. But at least according to the assessment of ECHA, and also from my understanding of the legal framework, the question whether European approach accreditation can actually be recognized instead of a national accreditation is still a bit questionable and might be subject to restrictions or additional hurdles for institutions. And on the one hand, I see that there is some openness in the legal framework to allow that, but I think the possibility to use the European approach for joint programs is something that could be anchored more explicitly in the law. Then as a last point, maybe to just talk briefly about one future proposal for a future framework that is currently under development or under discussion at the European level, about external quality assurance or external evaluation at the level of European university alliances, for which I also have to disclose that so together with two other colleagues, have the pleasure to support the Commission in developing further scenarios for this implementation. This is an idea that is based on the EU Council recommendation that was adopted last year, and that proposed to create an opportunity for an external evaluation of a whole European University Alliance as an optional or as a voluntary opt-in framework for alliances that want to go that way. The idea is that, of course, it would not necessarily cover the whole alliance, as in cover all institutions and everything they do in an alliance, but first and foremost, it would cover those joint education activities that an alliance develops and that are subject to some kind of joint internal quality assurance arrangements within the alliance. So, for example, joint programs developed by the alliance, micro-credentials developed jointly, etc. The idea is generally that such a framework should cover the ESG, of course, should cover the European approach standards, and should also be linked to the criteria for a European degree label that, as some of you might know, is also under discussion of implementation already, with the idea that if an alliance has passed successfully such an external evaluation, it could self-accredit its joint programs and also award the European degree label to its own joint programs as far as they comply. In practice, so as part of this work for supporting the Commission in developing more practical scenarios for this, we have looked at the status quo, which is actually that beyond some pilot projects in the so-called unique project a few years ago and a few evaluations that were done since then, this is not happening in practice at all yet, at least not as an external evaluation, and that the field of internal quality assurance at the alliance level is quite diverse, because of course European university alliances are extremely diverse in terms of what activities they do, how they coordinate activities together, and the let's say the range we have seen from interviews with alliances is from let's say a very thin layer of coordination between the own institutions' internal quality assurance systems to alliances that have let's say a more ambitious maybe a goal of really developing almost a full joint internal quality assurance system for the alliance activities that would kind of sit next to the individual institutions' internal quality assurance arrangements. As I said, the work on turning this into practical scenarios is still going on, but from what we can see so far is that there might be different options and different routes, and there might be some alliances for whom that might be an attractive thing, because they might maybe have the aim of having a more integrated alliance-wide quality assurance system, and there might be other alliances for whom that is not relevant, or at least not relevant for the near future. Yeah, with this short comment on that aspect, yeah, I'd like to finish. Thanks again for inviting me here to join you, and hope we can have some discussion about these topics.
Okay, thank you. I'll try this one. Thank you very much, Colin. Do you have any questions to Colin you'd like to ask? Not. Maybe Anna would like to ask one question, Colin, based on your experience and what Colin was presenting. Can you ask Colin one question? What was, please?
Sure. Hi, Colin. Nice to see you. It's been a while. Well, maybe you know, you mentioned you've been working now in a much broader area than just quality assurance. So from that sort of broader perspective, are you seeing anything that maybe you think, you know, this is something that quality assurance really could address? I hesitate to ask, having previously advocated for not putting too much into quality assurance, but maybe you know, yeah, from your bigger picture perspective, is there anything that strikes you?
Well, maybe I would mention, sorry, I'm still working. Maybe I would mention two things. I mean, one is maybe the let's say the phenomenon of micro-credentials or similar kind of smaller self-standing learning opportunities that institutions are increasingly offering to either their own students or to foreign students or to learners who really come just for a micro-credential, which I think is something that quite clearly quality assurance should respond to, or should at least have in mind when designing quality assurance processes, that it's not only about full degree programs, but also about this kind of smaller self-standing offers. I think in practice that is already happening, and I am quite sure that is also probably discussed quite a bit in the ESG revision. And yeah, I think it's getting increasingly important that also the official frameworks always reflect that this is happening. And maybe another point, of course, it would be strange not to mention the increased use of AI and in education, but I see that is likely also something that the ESG are taking up, and I'm sure also a lot of quality assurance agencies are taking up, and I'm sure quality assurance will have quite an important role in, let's say, also taking into account whether a lot of good principles that are maybe being developed on ethical use of AI in education. I mean, there are nice also European Commission publications and various other guidelines and frameworks and good practices. And I think sooner or later quality assurance will probably be one of the tools that has to also take into account whether this different guidelines or codes of practices are actually used and are actually observed in practice. And I guess that will be quite an important element.
Thank you very much. I think it's nice that you mentioned micro-credentials, because we discussed micro-credentials even with Professor Miller a week ago at conference. So it's important, the quality of these learning, small learning units. But I would have one more question based on your own experience. If you can mention or name some good practices of agencies, how to support the enhancement aspect in the system. Even you mentioned that they main role is accountability at the first place, but also the second one we see as important more and more. If you can remember or mention some good cases, how the agency, let's say, support development of this aspect in the system. Thanks.
I would maybe it's better, that would even be a better question to Anna than to me. But I mean, I don't want to mention names of agencies, but I think the things that come to my mind is that, of course, first of all, maybe ensuring in the, let's say, training and work with the experts to always, let's say, inform, because let's say the people who will actually be the agency in practice towards an institution are, of course, one of the agency staff member who goes there, but also the experts who go there. So they will be the face of the agency. And I think in ensuring in the training and briefing of experts to strongly, let's say, emphasize that they should be critical friends and not just compliance checkers or worse. That's of course maybe the first step. I think another important step is taking, let's say, not only focusing on the review, on the result now, but taking follow-up of recommendations series. I know that some agencies are, some agencies are having some structured follow-up process after 1 or 2 years to see how the institution have worked with the recommendations and give some feedback that is not compliance-oriented but purely supportive. There are also some agencies, I think, that organize some kind of seminars or on the one hand, some formal activities bringing different institutions together to jointly discuss their recommendations they have received, how they have responded to them, and have it on the one hand in a formal process, but on the other hand also keeping it enhancement oriented and not making this a compliance exercise. So yeah, that's the first things that would come to my mind.
Thank you. And I would you like to add something to what Colin said?
Sure, I could perhaps add a couple of other elements. We see some agencies, so I think, one thing to reflect on is going beyond just the agency standards and criteria. So we see some agencies, for example, which in addition to the institutional review, they have some kind of enhancement area where there's a sort of thematic approach where for each cycle of reviews, they pick a specific area that they're going to focus on from a more enhancement aspect. In some systems, even the institution can choose its own area where it wants to look at and have some more support from a more enhancement perspective, knowing that the kind of baseline standards have already been met. And then the second thing I would perhaps mention is agencies looking at themselves with a role of also having a convening power of bringing together the higher education community within a specific sector. So it's not just about the agency's role in conducting the external quality assurance processes, but also bringing together institutions and other stakeholders to discuss issues that are particularly relevant in their own context. And this helps to shape the picture of the agency as not just being a kind of control organization, a checking organization, but also one that facilitates that discussion, and it is part of that conversation across the whole sector.
Okay, so short, Colin.
Yeah, I know time is pressing, but just one additional thought on this. I mean, not everything at national level needs to be done by the agency. I mean, there are also networks such as yours, and sometimes, of course, the agency can do a lot of things, but also it's constrained by ESG and by not mixing up consulting and auditing functions. So some things can also be done by other national networks, not the agency.
Okay. So thank you very much, both of you, for I think wonderful presentation and great discussions. And now I can officially finish this session by ringing the bell. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Já moc děkuji za tady tuto první mezinárodní vsuvku s tím, že jsme trošku přetekli přes čas, ale jako na správné konferenci stane se. Každopádně 15-minutová přestávka platí a všechno si posuneme o 15 minut. Děkuju.